My ex-wife hadn't seen me in 8 years, so when she spotted me walking into our high school reunion alone, in a suit she probably thought I'd borrowed, she leaned over to her friends and laughed. I heard every word. I didn't say anything. I just smiled and walked to the bar. 20 minutes later, the man who paid $1.3 billion for my company walked through that lobby, saw me across the room and said, "Earl, thank God, I've been looking for you all evening." If you've ever been underestimated by someone who was supposed to know you best, drop a comment below and hit subscribe, because this story is going to feel very personal to a lot of you. Earl Dutton was not a man who needed much to feel like himself. A cup of coffee before the sun came up, the particular quiet of a house that hadn't started its day yet, and something useful to do with his hands, that was enough. He grew up in Orange Mound on the east side of Memphis, in a neighborhood that had been built by black families who understood that dignity wasn't something the world handed you. It was something you constructed, carefully, out of whatever materials you had available. His father worked 31 years on a factory floor and never once complained about it at the dinner table, not because the work was easy, but because complaining about a thing you've chosen to carry is a waste of the breath you need to carry it. Earl absorbed that the way children absorb the things their parents never sit them down to teach. Slowly, completely, without knowing it was happening until the lesson was already part of him. He became a shop teacher at Melrose High School in 1987 and stayed for 16 years because he was good at it and because good work done consistently is its own reward, regardless of what it pays. He taught teenage boys how to read a blueprint, how to measure twice before cutting once, how to take a raw piece of material and turn it into something that could bear weight. Half his students didn't realize until years later that he hadn't been teaching them woodworking at all. He had been teaching them how to think. In his second year of teaching, he met Carolyn Harris at a church function in Whitehaven. Sharp, beautiful, the kind of organized that made everything around her look accidental by comparison. They were married in 1988, in a ceremony her mother planned down to the last ribbon. Earl wore a rented suit and meant every word he said. For the first several years, the marriage was genuinely good in the way that early marriages are good when two people are still becoming the people they're going to be and haven't yet noticed the gap between where they started and where they're each headed. Carolyn moved up through the administrative ranks at a Memphis hospital system. More responsibility, better title, a different quality of colleague at every level. Earl taught shop class and came home with sawdust on his shirt and started spending his summers in the garage with a yellow legal pad and a second-hand computer, and an idea that his father would have called sensible, and most people would have called small. He wanted to supply industrial parts to mid-size manufacturers across the Mid-South. Fasteners, fittings, the unglamorous hardware that held production lines together, and that nobody thought about until it wasn't there. He started making calls in June of 1994. By August, he had 3 clients. Carolyn called it a hobby. She said it without malice, the way you say something that feels true from where you're standing, and Earl didn't argue because he was too busy filling his first real order to spend energy on the conversation. What Carolyn never knew, what Earl never sat her down to explain because it wasn't his nature to build a case for himself in his own home, was the size of what he was actually constructing in that garage. By 2001, Dutton Industrial Supply had 12 employees and a warehouse off Lamar Avenue. By 2005, it had 43 employees and contracts with manufacturers in 4 states. Earl still drove the same pickup truck, still came home with his hands showing the evidence of whatever needed doing that day. He never moved the business into dinner conversation because Carolyn had stopped asking about it somewhere around 2003, and Earl had learned by then that describing his work to someone who had already categorized it was a different thing entirely from actually doing it. So he kept doing it. And the company kept growing in the dark the way things grow when they're rooted deep enough that they don't need anyone watching to know which direction is up. He turned down a partnership offer from his cousin Jerome in Atlanta in the spring of 2006. Jerome had a distribution operation that was expanding and wanted Earl's supply network folded into it. It would have meant relocating, and Carolyn's mother had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's that winter. Earl called Jerome, thanked him, and said the timing wasn't right. He never told Carolyn the dollar figure attached to that offer because he didn't want her to feel like a reason he'd lost something. That was the year he also quietly paid the first semester of her younger brother Darnell's college tuition at the University of Memphis. Darnell was 22, Proud in the way young men are proud when pride is the only currency they have. And Earl routed the money through a small family account in a way that let Darnell believe it came from a scholarship fund Carolyn's mother had set aside years earlier. He paid 3 years of it. Darnell graduated in 2009 and thanked his mother at the ceremony. Earl stood in the back row and clapped and meant it. By 2010, Carolyn had met Dr. Philip Reeves at a hospital gala, a cardiothoracic surgeon, Germantown address, the kind of man whose profession announced itself in every room he entered before he opened his mouth. Earl noticed the shift in her gray, the way he noticed most things. Quietly, without accusation, giving it time to be something other than what it looked like before he decided what it was. It was what it looked like. By 2014, she told him she was leaving. She said she needed a partner who matched where she was going. She said it in the living room on a Sunday afternoon, standing near the window with her arms crossed, the way people stand when they've already made a decision and are delivering it rather than discussing it. Earl looked at her for a long moment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask her to reconsider. He didn't list a single thing he had done or given or quietly absorbed over 19 years to make her life easier than she knew. He simply asked her one question, just one. And the calmness in his voice when he asked it unsettled her in a way she would not be able to name for years. And what he said in that living room on that Sunday afternoon, before he went back to the garage and got to work, was the last thing Carolyn Dutton ever expected a man she had just left to say. The morning after Carolyn left, Earl was in the garage by 6. Not because he was running from anything. Earl Dutton had never been a man who ran, but because the work was there, and the work had always been the most honest thing in his life. He made coffee in the same pot, poured it into the same thermos his father had used on factory mornings, and sat at the work table with his yellow legal pad and a list of calls he needed to return before noon. People expected wreckage. His sister Donna called 3 times in the first week, waiting to hear him come apart. His pastor stopped by on a Wednesday with the careful expression of a man prepared to sit with grief. Earl fed him lunch, talked about the Grizzlies, and walked him to his car an hour later, leaving the pastor with the mildly confused look of someone who had shown up to a fire and found a man quietly tending his garden instead. The divorce hurt. Earl never pretended otherwise, at least not to himself in the early mornings before the day started. But hurt and broken are not the same address, and Earl had always known the difference. What the next 8 years looked like from the outside depended entirely on who was doing the looking. From Orange Mound, from the warehouse off Lamar Avenue, from the loading docks and conference calls and the slow, patient work of building something national out of something regional, those 8 years looked like a man in full. Dutton Industrial Supply crossed into 7 states by 2017. By 2019, they had contracts with 3 Fortune 500 manufacturers and a payroll that would have made the shop teacher version of Earl Dutton laugh out loud if he'd seen it written down in 1994. He hired well and trusted the people he hired and stayed out of their way once he'd shown them what good work looked like, which was the same thing he'd done with his students at Melrose, and which worked just as well with adults who were paid considerably more than high schoolers. He never moved to a bigger office, never bought a boat, never did a single thing that announced what the company had become, because announcing things had never once been how Earl operated, and success wasn't about to change that now. Gerald Fitch's firm, Fitch Capital Partners out of Nashville, had been watching Dutton Industrial for 2 years before they made the call. Gerald was the kind of private equity man Earl could respect because he had started with nothing romantic either, a middle-class family in Knoxville, a state school education, and the understanding that the unglamorous middle of American industry was where real and lasting money lived if you were patient enough to wait for it. They met for the first time over breakfast at a diner off I-40 in Jackson, Tennessee, halfway between Memphis and Nashville, because Earl suggested it and Gerald said yes without hesitation, which told Earl something useful about the man before he'd finished his eggs. 18 months ago, they closed the acquisition at $1.3 billion. Earl retained 40% and the chairman title and went back to Memphis and told exactly 4 people, his sister Donna, his daughter from a brief relationship in the early 80s named Tanya, who lived in Nashville, his attorney, and his oldest friend Calvin Marsh. Calvin said nothing for a full 10 seconds on the phone. Then he said, "Earl, your daddy would have folded that number up and put it in his chest pocket and never said a word." Earl said he knew. Calvin said, "So would you." And they both laughed the way men laugh when something is so true it becomes funny. Calvin Marsh had known Earl since the third grade at Leicester Elementary, and had therefore earned the right to say things to Earl that most people didn't attempt. It was Calvin who called on a Thursday evening in late August and told Earl about the reunion, the 45th, the Peabody Hotel, October, the whole production. Earl said he hadn't thought about it. Calvin said that was because Earl hadn't thought about most things that didn't involve work or family since 2014, and that at 64 years old it was time to reintroduce himself to the concept of showing up somewhere just because he felt like it. Earl said he didn't see the point. Calvin said the point wasn't the reunion. The point was that Earl had spent the better part of a decade being invisible by choice, and there was a difference between humility and disappearing. And Calvin wasn't sure Earl still knew where that line was. Earl was quiet on the phone for a moment. Then he said he'd think about it. Calvin had known him since the third grade and knew exactly what that meant. From Carolyn's side of the city, those same 8 years had looked like a rival. Philip's income put them in a house in Germantown, with a kitchen that belonged in a magazine and a social calendar that required its own management system. She chaired committees, she attended galas, she wore the life well, because Carolyn had always been good at wearing things well. It was one of the things Earl had genuinely admired about her, the way she could walk into any room and belong to it immediately. But belonging to a room and being at peace inside one are different things, and by year 5 of the marriage to Philip, the difference had started showing in small ways that only someone paying close attention would catch. Philip was not unkind. He was simply absent in the particular way that driven, status-conscious men are absent, physically present, emotionally elsewhere, more comfortable being admired than known. Carolyn had traded one kind of loneliness for a more expensive version of the same thing, and she was intelligent enough to know it, even if she wasn't ready to say it out loud. She heard about the reunion through their old classmate Brenda in early September, and decided immediately that she and Philip would go. Philip said he'd try to make it, which in his language meant he would not make it, and sure enough, a surgical scheduling conflict emerged 2 weeks before the date that made his attendance impossible. Carolyn went alone, which she reframed to herself as independence, and to her friends as proof that she didn't need her husband attached to her hip to walk into a room confidently. Both things were partially true, and neither one was the whole truth. She arrived at the Peabody that October evening in a dress that cost more than Earl's first month of business revenue, which would have meant something different to her if she'd known what Dutton Industrial's current revenue looked like on a spreadsheet. She didn't know. Nobody in that ballroom knew. And when she spotted Earl Dutton near the entrance, alone, in a suit she privately clocked as modest, the old measuring habit kicked in before she could examine whether it still made any sense. Before we get to what happened inside that ballroom, drop a comment and tell us, have you ever walked back into a room full of people who wrote you off? Tell us below, because what Earl walked into that night at the Peabody, not even Calvin could have scripted it. The Peabody Hotel in downtown Memphis is the kind of place that makes people feel like the best version of themselves before they've even found their table. The ceilings in the grand ballroom go up farther than they need to. The chandeliers throw light that flatters everyone equally, and the whole room carries the particular energy of people who have not seen each other in decades and are simultaneously glad about that and pretending otherwise. Earl arrived at 7, parked his own car in the garage on 2nd Street the way he always parked his own car, and walked through the Peabody lobby in his charcoal suit with his father's watch on his wrist and the unhurried stride of a man who has nowhere to prove he's going. The lobby smelled like the flower arrangements the hotel was known for, and something underneath that, old wood, river air, the specific gravity of a city that has survived more than it's been given credit for. Earl felt at home in it. Memphis was his, and he was Memphis, and no amount of anything had ever changed that. Carolyn was near the registration table when he walked in, standing with 3 women Earl recognized from the class of 1979, Brenda Sykes, who had organized the event, and 2 others whose names came back to him slowly, the way names do when you haven't needed them in 45 years. Carolyn saw him at the same moment he saw her. She smiled the way people smile when they are deciding in real time how to play a situation, and then she leaned toward Brenda and said something that produced laughter from the small cluster, her eyes still tracking Earl across the lobby. He heard the tone of it, if not the words. He had spent 19 years learning the music of Carolyn's social performances, and the melody hadn't changed. He nodded in her direction, pleasant and unbothered, and moved toward the bar. Behind him, he heard her voice carry just enough, still the same Earl, still showing up alone, some things never change, and the laughter that followed it. Earl ordered a club soda, turned to face the room, and let it pass through him, the way river water passes a post that's been planted long enough. He found Calvin near the back of the ballroom 20 minutes later, and the two men stood together, the way old friends stand when they don't need to fill every silence. Comfortable, unhurried, watching the room do what reunion rooms do. Calvin had already heard Carolyn's remarks from two people, and reported this to Earl with the expression of a man who finds the situation both maddening and vindicating. Earl told him to let it go. Calvin said he was letting it go. He was just noting it for the record. Earl laughed, the first real laugh of the evening, and for a while the two of them simply talked the way they had talked since the 3rd grade, about Memphis, about people they'd known, about the way the city kept changing in ways that felt wrong, until suddenly they felt right. Earl had not thought about the billion-dollar acquisition once, since walking through the lobby doors. He was not there to be anything other than what he had always been, and what he had always been was enough to fill an evening without assistance. Beverly Carr found him just before 8. She came around the edge of the dance floor with the careful walk of a woman whose knees had opinions about hardwood floors after a certain age, and when Earl saw her face he felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. Beverly had been his first real friendship with a girl, back when they were 16, and neither one of them had the vocabulary for what easy and genuine company felt like between two young people who weren't performing for each other. She had married young, moved to Nashville, raised 3 children, taught 4th grade for 31 years, and lost her husband to a stroke 2 years ago. All of that was in her face, in the way real life gets into a face. Not harshly, just honestly. They embraced the way people embrace, when time has been long, but the warmth was never the issue. Earl told her she looked wonderful. Beverly told him he looked like he'd finally figured out how to sleep. They both laughed and found 2 chairs near the edge of the room and began the particular conversation that only exists between people who knew each other before life had a chance to complicate them. Carolyn noticed within 4 minutes. Earl knew this not because he was watching her, but because he had spent 19 years developing a peripheral awareness of Carolyn's attention that apparently did not expire with the marriage. She materialized at the edge of their conversation with a fresh drink and the bright social smile she deployed when she was doing something she didn't want to look like she was doing. She greeted Beverly with warmth that was 2 degrees too warm to be entirely natural, called her honey in a way that managed to sound both affectionate and diminishing, and then turned the conversation with the practiced ease of a woman who had been redirecting rooms since she was 25. Beverly, who had spent 31 years managing classrooms full of 9-year-olds and understood exactly what was happening, responded with a graciousness so complete it had no target. Earl said nothing. He watched Carolyn's second remark land, something about Beverly's years of teaching, framed as admirable in a tone that made it sound like consolation, and he watched 3 people within earshot catch it and glance at each other. That was the thing about a room full of people who had known you since you were 17. There was no version of yourself you could perform that they didn't have the original recording of somewhere in their memory. Calvin appeared at Earl's shoulder shortly after, and Beverly excused herself to find the restroom, and in her absence, Carolyn's composure recalibrated visibly, the brightness dialing back, something more considered taking its place, the awareness that the room had just watched her do something that didn't reflect well arriving in her expression about 30 seconds after it would have been useful. She said something to Earl about Beverly, something that was meant to sound like concern and landed as something smaller. Earl looked at her the way his father used to look at things that weren't worth the energy of a full response. Not with contempt, just with the mild patience of a man who has already moved on from a conversation that hasn't finished yet. He said Beverly seemed like she was doing well. Carolyn nodded. The silence between them said everything neither of them were going to say out loud, in the middle of the Peabody Ballroom at their 45th reunion, with 40 people in peripheral vision. She drifted back toward Brenda's cluster a few minutes later, and Earl watched her go without feeling anything that needed to be named. At 8:47, Calvin nudged Earl's arm. Earl turned toward the lobby entrance. Gerald Fitch was standing just inside the Peabody's main doors in a dark suit, scanning the room the way a man scans a room when he's looking for one specific face among many. And then Gerald's eyes found Earl's across the full length of that grand ballroom, and his face broke into the wide, unguarded recognition of a man who has just spotted someone he is genuinely glad to see, and he began walking toward him with the kind of purposeful stride that turns heads in a room full of people with nothing better to do than notice who commands whose attention. Gerald Fitch crossed that ballroom the way men cross rooms when they've stopped caring who's watching them do it. He reached Earl and pulled him into a handshake that turned into something closer to an embrace, the kind two men share when a great deal of trust has passed between them over a long stretch of time. "Earl, thank God," he said, loud enough for the nearest cluster of classmates to catch every word. "I've been looking for you all evening. I didn't know you'd be here. I'm 3 doors down for the Fitch Capital Regional Dinner, and somebody mentioned Dutton Industrial's chairman might be in the building." Earl said something plain in return, something about it being good to see him, and the ordinary warmth of that exchange between two men who clearly knew each other well did more damage to the room's assumptions than any grand announcement could have managed. Because a room can dismiss a rumor, it cannot dismiss what it just watched with its own eyes. Brenda Sykes was the first to ask, because Brenda had organized the reunion and therefore felt some ownership over understanding everyone in it. She asked Gerald, lightly, how he knew Earl. Gerald looked at her the way a man looks at a question he assumes everyone in the room already knows the answer to, and said that Fitch Capital had acquired Dutton Industrial Supply 18 months ago for $1.3 billion, and that Earl had stayed on as chairman because, frankly, the whole operation would have suffered without him. He said this the way a man reports a well-known fact, not a revelation, because from where Gerald stood, it was one. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds before the room's noise returned, but those seconds did more work than an hour of conversation could have. Earl watched faces shift in real time, the recalibration people do when a version of someone they thought they understood gets replaced all at once by a version they hadn't considered. He didn't enjoy it exactly, but he didn't look away from it either. Carolyn heard it from 12 feet away, mid-sentence with Brenda's sister, and Earl watched the words land on her the way a stone lands on still water, the surface breaking, then rippling outward in ways she had no control over. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her face did the talking for a moment longer than she would have wanted, and then she recovered the practiced composure that had carried her through 2 marriages and 1 hospital gala circuit, excused herself from the conversation, and walked toward the ladies' room with a steadiness that cost her something to maintain. Earl didn't watch her go. He had already turned back toward Gerald, asking about the regional dinner down the hall, genuinely more interested in that conversation than in whatever was happening behind Carolyn's composed exit. Inside the ladies' room, Carolyn stood at the mirror longer than she needed to. She fixed nothing about her appearance, because nothing about her appearance required fixing. She just stood there, under the soft gold lighting the Peabody was known for, and looked at the woman looking back at her, and the question that surfaced wasn't the one she expected. It wasn't about the money. Carolyn was intelligent enough to know that a number on a balance sheet didn't retroactively make her decision wrong or right. People left good marriages and stayed in bad ones, for reasons that had nothing to do with wealth, and she had genuinely believed at the time that she was leaving towards something rather than away from something valuable. The question that actually surfaced, standing there under lights that flattered her and told her nothing true, was smaller and harder to hold. It was whether she had ever really known the man she was married to for 19 years, or whether she had simply decided early on what category he belonged in, and stopped looking closely enough to notice when he outgrew it. She didn't answer it. Some questions don't get answered in a hotel bathroom in 40 seconds. She touched up nothing, breathed once, and walked back out with her chin exactly where she always kept it. Earl found Beverly again, near the end of the evening, back at the same 2 chairs by the edge of the dance floor where they'd started. She hadn't said anything about Gerald Fitch or the number that had moved through the room like weather. She simply asked him if he was doing all right, the way she'd have asked one of her 4th graders after a hard day, and Earl told her honestly that he was. They talked for another half hour about nothing that mattered and everything that did: her late husband, her grandchildren in Nashville, the particular quiet of a house after 31 years of noisy classrooms went silent for good. When the evening wound down and people started collecting coats, Beverly wrote her number on the back of a cocktail napkin in handwriting that hadn't changed since 1978 and Earl folded it once and put it in his jacket pocket next to nothing in particular, because it didn't need to mean anything more than it already did. She told him to call sometime, not soon, whenever. He said he would. Neither of them dressed it up as more than what it was, which was exactly why it felt like it might eventually become something worth having. Earl said his goodbyes to Calvin in the lobby, shook Gerald's hand once more, and walked out to his car alone under the Peabody's awning, with the October air doing what it does in Memphis this time of year. Cool enough to notice, not cold enough to complain about. He drove east out of downtown with his windows down, past the lit-up buildings along Union Avenue, past the river he couldn't see anymore, but always felt somewhere behind him regardless, out toward Germantown, where his house sat quiet and unchanged the way he'd left it. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't replay the evening in his head, the way a man does when he's still trying to make sense of something. There was nothing left to make sense of. Carolyn's remarks, Gerald's greeting, Beverly's napkin folded in his pocket. None of it needed further examination, because Earl Dutton had spent his whole life building things that didn't require anyone's applause to know they were solid. The road opened up in front of him, dark and familiar, and somewhere past the second stoplight, he rolled his shoulders back the way his father used to, after a long shift, and let the night carry him the rest of the way home. If Earl's story reminded you of your own quiet years, the ones nobody applauded but you kept showing up for anyway, hit subscribe right now. We tell these stories every week, about people who built something real while the world was busy looking somewhere else. Don't miss the next one.